This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Well, Washington is getting ready for that July 4th break coming up, but it has a lot of work to do up on Capitol Hill between now and then with some major legislation they're trying to push through. To take us through that agenda, we welcome now Republican Senator Todd Young of Indiana, who sits in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Senator, thanks so much for being with us. Before we get to that agenda, let's just spend 1 minute on Ukraine, because you are on the Foreign Relations Committee. You are yourself a veteran of the Marine Corps. So give us a sense of where we are. We hear from General Milley that it's really tough for the Ukrainians right now. They are outmatched in terms of weaponry, and I understand there's another $1 billion headed their way.
Well, it took a bit of time, David, but I will say that the administration has been sending all kinds of weaponry in the wake of a $40 billion spending package to Ukraine passed by Congress. And we need to and will, of course, continue to provide weapons to the Ukrainians. But I would really emphasize that it's time for our allies to continue to dig deep and understand that we are extended all over the world. Our military is needed to watch Iran, to park ourselves in the Asia-Pacific and ensure that the Chinese don't continue to grab more territory. So it's time for the allies to increasingly assume more responsibility there, to apply leverage against the Russians and hopefully drive this to a negotiated settlement at some point in coming months.
Thank you so much for that. It's really helpful. Let's turn now to that legislative agenda, and there are at least a couple of major pieces of legislation that I'm aware of. One is the so-called USICA, I think it's U.S. Innovation and Competition Act. It comes out of the CHIPS Act in part, and also there's some gun legislation pending. On the USICA, it's in conference committee. There's a version from the House that goes much farther than the one from the Senate. What are the odds that you're able to come to terms with the two houses and get some legislation to the president next week?
Well, I think it's going to happen, but negotiations are ongoing. We passed that legislation, the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act, out of the U.S. Senate with roughly 70 votes a year ago. So it's hard to get a bipartisan vote like that, but we worked hard at it. And essentially what we're trying to do here is make sure that the United States can outcompete and out-innovate the Chinese Communist Party as it relates to national security technologies moving forward. So we increase federal investments in those areas, and there's going to be incredible opportunities for my constituents in Indiana and other Americans around the country to develop and to manufacture these technologies at home. And the other piece of it, which my constituents are very familiar with, is computer chips. There aren't enough of them. Just about anything with an on-off switch requires a computer chip these days, and we are 100% dependent on other countries right now for the manufacture of the highest-end computer chips, like the ones that go into our missile system. So there's a real urgency for us to pass this package so that we can reshore the manufacture of these high-end computer chips here in the United States of America.
So it sounds like you think it's going to get through. Is that going to be a lot closer to the Senate version than the House? Because, as I said, my understanding is the House is much broader, covers a lot more, and the Senate really wants it more narrow. Is it going to be closer to your version?
Well, it's going to have to be close to the Senate version. In fact, very closely resemble the Senate version for Republicans to stay on board. You know, in the House, they took, frankly, a pretty partisan approach. You only had one Republican member of Congress who supported that version. So even my Democratic colleagues in the House seem to understand, with a few exceptions, that the final work product will resemble the Senate package if we want to make a law.
And what about the gun legislation? There is bipartisan agreement. As I understand it, they're still negotiating the language. They haven't come to terms on the language yet. Do you anticipate that that may well get through the Congress before the 4th of July break?
Yeah, you know, I'm actually really encouraged, number one, that we have Senator John Cornyn walking point on this negotiation. Like me, he's someone who has consistently earned an A+ rating from the NRA, so he's very concerned about making sure that we ensure our children are protected, that mentally ill people aren't getting their hands on guns if they present a harm to others or to themselves. But at the same time, I think he's the sort of person who can end up with an agreement. So we have a framework right now, and that framework, which would increase resourcing at our school to keep them safe and provide more mental health resources to Americans, among other priorities, is being turned into legislative language. So I haven't had the benefit of looking at that, but I'm going to give it fair consideration in coming days, and I think it has a very good chance of becoming law.
And finally, Senator, obviously a big concern, I think, for everyone every single American right now is inflation and the economy. Now there's talking about a possible recession. Is there anything Congress can do to help on that, or do you have to sit off to the sidelines and watch the Federal Reserve and the administration?
Well, you know, there are things that Congress could do. Congress could repeal some of the onerous regulations that have been imposed or are being threatened against our oil and gas sector. We could seek reassurances from the administration with respect to the future intentions in over-regulating oil and gas so that the price of gas goes down. We can reduce tariff barriers on certain things that are critical inputs to our manufactured goods. So these are all things that I have consistently proposed, but they're frankly inconsistent with the Biden administration's agenda. They don't want to produce more oil and gas here. They've been piling more regulations on top of the existing regulations, and they still continue to press for much higher taxes on our businesses and other individuals as we head into a very challenging inflationary environment for Hoosiers and other Americans.
So, Senator, to summarize sort of what I'm hearing, there are some things that there is some bipartisan support for, such as the USICA coming out of the CHIPS Act, such as some form of gun legislation. But when it comes to the economy, it's awful hard to get bipartisan support. Is there any piece of it you think the Republicans and Democrats could do together? Because, as I say, I think it's probably the #1 concern of a lot of Americans today.
Yeah, the economy absolutely is. Increasingly, I'm hearing, at least behind closed doors and in less public circles from some of my Democratic colleagues, a recognition of the fact that perhaps they've swung too far in their Green New Deal agenda. Perhaps we actually will need oil and gas resources for an extended period of time, and we can slowly transition into a greener energy economy. I think we can agree on energy efficiency measures. I think we probably can agree on paring down some of the regulations that add cost to the things we buy. And if Democratic leadership and the administration would place more emphasis on these things as opposed to what, frankly, I would regard as a more ideological agenda, we could, at least on the margins, bring down prices in the near term.
Okay, thank you so much. Really good to have you back with us. That's Senator Todd Young, Republican of Indiana.